Hello, hello, my friends. AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink. Welcome back to my face and my card making space. And a shaped card. Don't do these very often, but this one is actually really easy to do. So I'm going to use a die set and a stencil set and some inks and some glitter paste to make a really fun birthday cake shaped card. Everything I used will be listed and linked in the description box below the video. My links are affiliate links. That just means that if you click on one of my links and end up placing an order, I do get a little kickback from that at no extra cost to you. It is what helps pay the bills, keeps the heaters going, enables me to continue bringing content. And that's it for the housekeeping. Let's get into making the card. So I'm using the Simon Says Stamp Big Birthday Cake layering stencil set, which has like 5 stencils in the set, and then the Big Birthday Cake wafer die set. And I die cut all of these pieces from Simon's Smooth White 120 pound cardstock. The only dies I didn't use from the set, there are 2 wafer dies for the sprinkles, and I'm not going to use those because I'm going to stencil the sprinkles on separately. So I've got all my die cuts, and you could skip the individual pieces if you wanted and could just stencil onto this cake layer. But I wanted to build dimension. So, and you could also skip stenciling on the base cake layer here if you wanted, because I am going to be adhering all these individual pieces kind of on top of it. However, I find that this just gives a little extra dimension. Plus, if you look, when the recipient looks like from the sides, there's color peeking out, if that makes sense, Plus, it was just fun. It didn't take much longer to stencil the actual cake. So the stencils, make sure they're flipped in the right direction, that they're right side up, because that's what I struggled with there for a second when I was adding the icing layer here. So I'm using Simon's Pawsitively saturated inks, and the first layer was bubblegum ink. And then I added a bit of Sweets ink to the icing just to give it a little more dimension. And then for the candle flames, I used butter. And then the die cut pieces are the exact, how do you say this? Like the exact shape of each portion, whereas the full cake wafer die has a little bit of an outline. Like you can see there's a bit of a white outline around that, which I kind of really like. But then the layering pieces are sized to the exact same size as the stencils, if that makes sense. So where I didn't need the stencils for the icing layers, I will use some of the stencils though to add the detail bits, which we'll get to in a minute. So I prefer, and I've talked about this before with when I'm inking things, I prefer to just ink on my glass work surface. So I just pull it off my grip mat that I have everything arranged on. And the icing pieces, I'm doing the same thing that I did as the stenciling. So bubblegum ink, my lightest shade, and then I add a bit of that Sweets ink just along the bottom. And again, you could skip this because when you get to the detail layer, that adds dimension as well, but this just gives it that little extra something. So after I did that, this next layer is the cake, the actual cake layer. And I'm using Tide Pool ink, which looks a little greener on here. It also doesn't help. I've talked about this. I don't wash my brushes. I don't clean them ever. I did have a bit of green ink in my brush, but I wasn't worried about it because I am going to adhere die cuts, pop them up on top of this. So I use Tide Pool and then Tropic ink. Just again, build that just little bits of dimension, which kind of redundant, but also it just also was giving me a visual because this is my first time using this set, and I was having fun with it. So I used Violet ink for the candles and then inked up the individual die cuts, and those I just kept stuck to the grip mat because they're little tiny die cuts. Those I'm not going to bother removing. I like that the grip mat holds those in place. And then for the individual dies for the cake layer, I wasn't paying attention and I used Tropic, which is the medium shade, to blend on this, but you know what? It was fine. I was fine with it. And in the end, it all looks fine. And my blending doesn't look perfect, but it doesn't matter. These inks do smooth out as they dry and the blend looks good. So I just kind of intensified the darkness along the top portions of the cake. But again, you could skip all of that and just keep it a little simpler. No need to, build up dimension when there's these little detail layers. So this adds the detail to the cake, like the shading basically. So for that I went with the darkest shade, which was Aegean, and used that on the individual die cuts pieces. So just stuck those to the grit mat and then lined up that stencil and added this right onto there with my blending brush. So then my die cuts have that detail, and then the icing, same thing. There is a wafer die or a stencil that adds the detail, like the shading basically. So for that I went with my darkest shade of the trio, which was Taffy. So I'm going to blend that on, and then I'll do the same thing to the individual icing die cuts. And then there's also a portion at the top of the stencil there that adds to the candle flames. So for that I used honey ink. And I'm going to do the same thing with the little individual die cuts as well. Just quickly line it up, slap on a little bit of ink, and then move on to the next one. So once I've got my little candles and the icing on the base layer, I'm going to add that to the die cuts as well. And it just makes everything pop. And like I said in the intro, this is simple. It's cute. So added my dollops of icing to this, and the whole time I was like, man, cake sounds really good right about now. Anyway, to build the dimension, I'm going to use foam squares. I have thin foam squares and thick foam squares. I use thin foam squares most of the time, but sometimes thick foam squares, like regular, basically. The thin ones are like a 16th of an inch, something like that. And then the thick ones are like an 1/8. I think that's what they are. Something like that. Anyway, I used thinner foam squares for the cake layers. So this is going to pop them up a bit, and this is why I did the stenciling on like the base layer, because with everything popped up, and I'll kind of show it when I tilt everything at the end, you can sort of see underneath this. So it does give everything a little bit more of a finished look. And then the icing layers, I'm going to pop up with the thick foam squares. So it doesn't look like much, of course, because I'm filming, straight down. But these are a little higher. So again, it's just a simple way to build a little bit of extra dimension. So I just added little foam squares, trimmed some pieces down, to get them into the nooks and crannies, and then popped them into place onto what this will be my card front eventually. So you could also do the stenciling, like when I use the glitter paste, you could stencil these icing pieces and then let everything dry and then adhere it. That works really well too. I didn't have a problem, thankfully. I was thankfully paying attention when I stenciled, but that is something you could do, and then assemble everything when you're done. Especially if you're doing multiples, I would probably do the pieces separately and do all the stenciling. I also wouldn't have assembled this until I stamped the sentiment, but the sentiment was an afterthought. So the base layer for the cake, like the bottom layer of the cake, I wouldn't have adhered this if I had thought of what I'm going to do for the sentiment. I made it work in the end, but it would have been so much easier if I hadn't assembled this card. But I was excited in putting it all together, and I was like, look at this, it's so cute. So I adhered all the pieces. And then the last stencil layer is the sprinkles. And you could also do these and then die cut them, because there is the wafer dies for them. But I just wanted to go directly onto the icing. So I lined up my stencil, and I'm using some Simon Hurley Astro paste in Prom Queen. And I'm just making sure, like I'm holding the stencil down, making sure it's flat, because everything's got all this dimension with all the, foam squares. So the stencil isn't, flat. So I'm holding the stencil to make sure it's flat so that I don't get paste oozing out everywhere. So this is what I meant by it would probably be easier to stencil the icing pieces separately, let everything dry. But hindsight. But as long as you're paying attention and not just glopping it on, everything should be good. So the sprinkles layer was pretty much dry by this point. You want to make sure it's at least dry enough. And then I used the other stencil for the little centers of the flames. And for that, I used, was a slippery when wet? Yeah, the slippery when wet Astro paste, which is like a gold glitter. Applied that, set that aside, let it dry. Now for my card base, I just scored, this is some Hammermill cardstock. I went with a bit lighter weight of cardstock because Simon's white cardstock is 120 pound, and it would work, but I'd probably have to die cut it a couple times to get it to cut all the way through. And sometimes that just ends up really pressing the die into the cardstock, and I just don't like it. So I just used a slightly lighter weight cardstock, and you saw me score it there. And then I just ran it through with the cake wafer die, keeping that score line below the candles, basically. And that created my little cake-shaped card. That's it. That's how simple it was. So I'll come back to the card base in a minute. The sentiment. I was going to do this separately, and then I looked at it and I was like, oh, this will fit right along the bottom. So this would have been easier to do. Again, without all the foam tape and everything, you know, popping everything up. Still was able to make it work, thankfully. So the sentiment is from the Sweet Birthday stamp set. And I used one of my grid sheets to line up that sentiment and give it a slight curve because it sticks to that grid sheet. And then I pressed the lid of my MISTI closed, picked up the sentiment so it's on that slight curve that follows the cake just a smidge. And then I used my anti-static powder tool and I'm stamping the sentiment with clear embossing ink. And this was where it was a little difficult and I had to do it multiple times. I'm trying not to push too hard because like I've said in videos, you don't need to do CPR on your stamps. And I don't want to push too hard because it's going to mush that stamp and lose the detail. So I just took my time, pressed it gently, did it multiple times, was able to get the whole sentiment stamped with the clear embossing ink, coated it with detail white embossing powder, used a brush just to remove any stray bits of the embossing powder that decided to cling where it didn't belong. And then I'm going to melt the embossing powder with my heat tool. Got my heat tool good and hot, melted the sentiment, used my my microfiber cloth to wipe away the excess anti-static powder, and the sentiment is right on the cake, and I love it, and it's super cute. So the cake base, the card base that is cake shaped, I stamped the inside with another sentiment from that same Sweet Birthday stamp set, and then I'm going to just adhere this to the back of the card front. So yeah, my card is cake shaped. It's so cute, and it'll stand up. I'll show that at the end. It stands up just fine, so you can, you know, put it on display. I think it's just adorable. So you could stop here, but I wanted to add one final, you know, bit of embellishment. So I just pulled out my white gel pen and drew little stripes on the candles, because for me, birthday candles will always be those, like the ones with the color and white stripes. I don't know. Nostalgia. They're my favorite. So I drew the little stripes on the candles, and then I also just drew little highlights on the icing, just to give it that little extra bit of dimension. And then I'll tilt this in the light at the end here and show the sparkle of the sprinkles and the little candle flames. And yeah, this will fit in a standard A2 envelope, which I'm going to show, because the finished card ends up being roughly it's about 5 inches high, just a little more than 5 inches high, and the base of it, the base of the cake stand, is about 4 1/4 inches. So it'll fit in a standard A2 envelope. So that's what I use. This is one of Simon's metallic doll pink envelopes, and it's a cute little cake shaped card, and it stands up, which is fun. So yeah, not a whole lot of mental gymnastics for this one, other than, like I said, with the sentiment. Do that before adhering all the pieces together. It's just easier. But even then, I was able to make it work. It's sparkly and happy, and I hope you guys enjoyed. So, as always, thanks so much for hanging out with me. Thumbs upping and commenting helps a ton. I really appreciate it. Everything is linked down below, and I will see you all very soon in the next video. Bye! Thank you so much to my amazing Patreon supporters. For anyone that might be interested in joining my Patreon community and supporting me, the link to my Patreon is in the description box below the video. For everyone else, as always, thank you all so much for taking the time to watch my videos, for thumbs upping, commenting, subscribe if you haven't, I'd love to have you. And here's a couple other videos for you to check out in case you missed them. Bye!